Good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. Subject today is Crossrail and how our approach to planning. This is the fourth in a series of webinars. We've had one from program controls, reporting, and recently change control. And to go, we've got risk management, performance assurance, and commercial assurance. And this is all part of the Learning Legacy program which Crossrail has embarked upon. You see there on the slide there's access to information through Crossrail's Learning Legacy website, and if there are any particular questions about Learning Legacy in particular, then there's a Learning Legacy at crossrail.co.uk email address for anybody to ask any particular questions. So a bit of background, so there are 12 Learning Legacy themes. Today's webinar falls underneath the project and program management theme. You can see there are a number of others, procurement, engineering, operations through innovation, external affairs. So, there's a lot of information out there which Crossrail is looking to, or has documented. There is more information to be uploaded onto the website in September, so it's an ongoing sort of program of information sort of release which Crossrail is working its way through. So there's lots of good information out there to follow upon. In terms of planning, there are a number of papers on the Learning Legacy website. We have put together 4 micro reports. There will be more to follow, but managing and planning design has been a very challenging sort of planning aspect for Crossrail. We spent a lot of time trying to navigate our way through design, so there is a micro report on that. Reporting and how that falls and it relates to particular planning, there's one on that. In terms of interfaces, Crossrail obviously being a very large project has got a lot of interfaces, particularly with other industry partners such as Network Rail, London Underground as examples. So there's a paper there in terms of how we've tried to identify and manage those interfaces, and then how we plan to meet those interfaces and the various dependencies that we have. And then commodity monitoring and reporting, I'll come on to that later on with some examples, but it's certainly in terms of our tunneling program, our track program, and other key commodities which give an indication of our performance. There's a paper on there as well for anybody to access should they be interested in that. So what I'm going to talk today about is I'm just going to give a general overview of the program, some of the planning methodology or methodologies that we've adopted, and talk through where a lot of focus is in terms of our critical path for Crossrail, but in particular I will focus on the central section, the tunnel, the underground section, rather than so much of the surface works, because a lot of, I'm not saying that there's not a lot of work to be done on the surface works with Network Rail, but the lion's share of what we tend to look at in this program is in the central section beneath the centre of London. I'll show you some examples of some management information and reports as we focus on those to try and inform our senior management and give them the information that they need to react to and make the necessary management decisions. And then I'll sort of close off with, well, we've got about 2 years to go on this program before we open there's a Crossrail has a series of stages, but the main one where we'll be running trains through the central section happens in December 2018, and I'll talk about some of the challenges that we have, certainly from a planning perspective, with that time frame yet to go. So a bit about me. I started off sort of always in sort of project management. I worked for Parsons Brinckerhoff Asia in Hong Kong, working on the airport there, the new airport, and industrial projects in China, the road project in China. Following that, I worked for Level 3 Communications, which is a very large American telecoms organization. We were building fiber optic networks around the world, and there was doing project controls and project management as well as planning. And then for the past 13 or 14 years, I've been an associate of the Nichols Group, the family management consultancy, and my primarily sort of focus has been in the rail industry back in the UK since then. So that's me. About Crossrail, I think probably most people will certainly what we're trying to achieve in terms of there's a route map there, the interfaces there, how it interfaces with other rail connections and rail connections. So obviously a lot of interfaces. We spend a lot of time managing our interfaces, particularly again in the central section. You can see where the interchanges are with all of the London Underground lines, our connections out to Heathrow through the Piccadilly line. The lower map shows in red the underground sections, so really starting just west of Paddington through to Plumstead, which is sort of in the southeast, which is to the east of Woolwich, and then we come out just to the west of Stratford at Pudding Mill Lane. So that's an overview. There are 40 stations running from Reading in the west to Shenfield and Abbey Wood. 9 of those are new stations, and 8 are major new underground stations, which are all sort of concentrated in the middle there. So, and there's 42 kilometres of tunnels, which are all complete underneath the central section of London there. So, a quick overview of the project. So, in terms of today's topic and planning of Crossrail, so we have had an annual process of baselining our schedule for the past, well, I've been here 6 years, so for the past 6 or 7 years we have had an annual baseline which has served Crossrail. It is in its current form, which is the sort of second iteration, is now called the Master Operational Handover Schedule. It's been renamed that. Previously it was called the Master Control Schedule. It was renamed to give an emphasis on the operational and handover aspects of the program, and we have certainly added our efforts towards, or additional efforts towards identification of what those operational interfaces are and those handovers which we will have to do with the assets to the infrastructure managers, being Network Rail, Rail for London, London Underground, etc. So we have a number of levels of our Master Operational Handover Schedule. I'll come on to those a little bit later, but we've obviously got strategic aspects. So what you see on the right-hand side of the screen is effectively what we call our Level 0 strategic schedule. So we'll come back to it later. So we've got strategic aspects, we've got sectors. We're organized through a series of sectors at Crossrail, so stations is a sector, so civils, as is systems or system-wide as we call it. So we look at sector level, so sort of sub-program level, and then we obviously have individual projects, example being signalling, but it could be comms, it could be tunneling, many obviously with the program of projects we're managing here. And we have various levels of program to integrate those schedules together to make sure that they are fully joined up and we recognize dependencies and as necessary. We do use the industry standard planning software of Primavera. It's not the only tool that we use. That to me is the calculator, and very effective it is and very powerful, but it's not by any means the only way of portraying the planning information, because we do spend a lot of time communicating the information, which is obviously generated, a lot of it's generated through calculating critical path and so on in Primavera. So our Master Operational Handover Schedule has various components. We have an opening strategy. Say Crossrail is not going to all go into operation on one day. The opening, there's 5 aspects to, or 5 stages to the opening strategy. The first one is in May next year, when Crossrail will start running trains between Stratford, in the east, between Stratford and Liverpool Street. The second one is May 2018, when we'll start running trains out of Paddington Station. That's the existing Paddington railway station, out to Heathrow. We'll take over the Connect services, followed by the third one, which is when we'll start running trains through our central section. Our final 2 stages are when we join that all up into one integrated railway, which is due to be completed by December 2019. So we've got our opening strategy. We are very focused on our station builds, systems, rolling stock and depot. Obviously Bombardier is our contractor for our depot and rolling stock contract. We're very focused on and certainly becoming more focused on testing and commissioning. There's over a couple of £1 billion worth of work that Network Rail has to do, so that's a major part of our program. Obviously, almost everything we do on the surface, Network Rail, our industry partner, our delivery partner for that. We're very focused on handover and operations and making sure that our operations have those interfaces identified and the handovers are clear, so that we can make sure there is a smooth transition through handover into operations. Another aspect is obviously the critical paths. You can see there's a number of red bars on our master operational handover schedule indicating the critical paths. Moving on, some of the challenges that we have. So it's obviously a very large project, dealing with that complexity on a daily, weekly, or even an annual basis, making sure that we understand the information, those interfaces, and stitching it all together is obviously a constant challenge. We need to try and keep that as simple as we can, and that comes down to really effective communications, right from the project level, inter-project links and dependencies, right through to the strategic understanding of what we're trying to achieve with the overall program and the overall objectives of Crossrail. There's a lot of it, I'll come on to it in terms of the size of the team that we have. I'll go on to that now. So we have in terms of planning organization, we have we have had up to about 50 planners on this program, but a central core team of four staff, and we have a number of sectors to help manage those 50 staff planners. We have a team of 6 sector or lead planners managing, for example, system-wide, where we may have sort of 10 or 12 planners. To support that, we have a schedule management procedure, but probably more importantly, and I think it's probably on the Learning Legacy website, we have a planning handbook. About 4 years ago, we took the decision to document in a series of desktop instructions, as we call them, not just the nitty-gritty of how we approach planning and managing P6 and Primavera, but also some of our approaches and our standard methodology. So we've documented a lot of that. It's a continuously evolving handbook, so we add to that instructions as we need. So testing and commissioning might be a more recent one, where we've added that when our understanding and maturity has reached the point where we're ready to instruct the planning team exactly what we want them to do and how we want them to approach testing and commissioning, as an example, in a standardized way. So we have a schedule baseline. So having an annual baseline has served Crossrail very well. That's underpinned by a series of program level milestones. They're all well understood and reviewed on a regular basis or a periodic basis around Crossrail. So all that's worked well in terms of our methodology, which I'll come on to talk to some more. So in a sort of picture format, we have a number of levels of plans. The highest level, as in the previous slides, we have a strategic level plan, level 0 as we call it, maybe 100, 150 activities, but it's basically a very large sheet of A0, which is pinned up around the walls in Crossrail here in Canary Wharf in London and other offices. Then at lower level, we have an integrated level 1 program, which is really a sort of our proper sort of integrated program at level 1, which is up to sort of 5,000 activities. We run our schedule risk analysis on that model, but it's very much it's managed and looked after by our sector planners, but that's underpinned by individual project plans that individual project teams manage. Those individual projects identify their own dependencies. We manage those through an integration schedule, which is just the milestones. But what those level 2 schedules really do is, apart from identify more detail, and they roll up manually into our master operational handover schedule. So one of the important points here is that we don't automatically roll up any schedules, particularly when we are level 3 to level 2, where we have our contractor schedules, which remain independent from anything above. So we employ planners to interrogate those schedules and therefore roll that up into their respective Crossrail project schedules, which then get wrapped up into our overall integrated level 1 schedule. So that's the structure of how we approach planning in sort of 3 or 4 levels there. I'm now going to sort of move on to an example of what we've spent a lot of time thinking about in terms of our critical path and interfaces. And one of the things that we've done here over the past 2 years is to look closely at how we integrate our civils and tunnels program together with the stations, with what we need to do for track, and then also into our testing and commissioning. Obviously, following on from track, we've got a lot of services to install in our tunnels. We spend a lot of time looking at how we then integrate that, and also a backward pass into what our testing and commissioning strategy requires. So, time for some pictures. Here is a bored tunnel section. So between stations, that's what our TBMs produced or built. You see the segmented rings there. Typical tunnel section between any two stations, or even under the Thames in terms of one of our tunnels. There is a typical station. That's actually Bond Street Station, taken a few months ago. On the right-hand side, we've got the platform construction, and then in the middle, we've got the track. Okay, so that's what a typical, some of the interfaces I'm going to come on to talk about is how what the dependencies are between these various aspects of the program. We also have something called floating track slab. We have 2 areas of floating track slab on Crossrail. One is underneath the Barbican, and the other one is between Tottenham Court Road and Bond Street. It is effectively a noise suppression mechanism for damping any or attenuating any noise created by the trains and the track. And it's effectively, as it said, it is a floating sections of track that are suspended on springs to reduce noise breakout to noise-sensitive neighbours. So that's a critical aspect to our program, because it is very time-consuming, and what we've tried to do is contain that as much as we can and do as much of that work in parallel with the rest of our track program. That next picture is of a concreting train. It's 450-metre long mobile batching plant, which concretes in our standard track slab. Another important aspect of our program and our overall critical path in the central section. And then finally, we have our testing and commissioning strategies, and it's our central section there. The yellow and the green section, zones 1 and zones 2, is where we want to start our testing and commissioning first. So by the 1st of November 2017, that's where we want to start bringing in our first train, our new Class 345 train, and that's a huge date for this program. So Crossrail's working very hard to achieve that, and then what we want to do is to extend that to all zones within the central section in early January 2018. So having all those sort of major sort of components of our sort of central section critical paths, a couple of years ago, we wanted to try and sort of communicate what that looks like from a sort of high-level strategic understanding of what the program is. So what you see now on your screen back a couple of years ago was what we were trying to achieve. You got effectively the central section along the top, so ROP, that's Royal Oak Portal, then Paddington Station, Bond Street, Tottenham Court Road, Farringdon, and so on, all the way through to the east. And then we've got time down the left-hand side, and what we were trying to do is the red line, horizontal line, is the end-to-end tunnel systems. A target was to complete the track, walkways, and overhead line completed by the end of March 2017. Coupled with that is the jagged green line, which is what we were aiming for to hand over our tunnel sections. In support of that, to get our concreting train through, we needed to have our platforms complete. So you can see the platform built indicated there, and the vertical lines coming down, and it all kind of beautifully matched up. However, there's that floating track slab, was the other component of that. So we knew that was going to be time consuming, and we were trying to bring that up as much as we could into the heart of the program, get it done early, or at least in parallel with the rest of the operation. And then comes along our track concreting train, in the which is the red sort of parallel lines, seen as being the most efficient way of concreting in the track. We're not using a concreting train everywhere. You see on the right-hand side, we're using track concreting shuttles. They are pre-batched concrete and are just fed into the tunnels on a sort of daily basis, or every couple of days, to concrete in various sections. But getting the interfaces right between these components has been critical to the success of Crossrail. So first thing that happened a couple of years ago as we were developing our master operational handover schedule was that first section of floating track slab moved down in the program, so later, because we couldn't get the access, or bringing up the floating track. So what that meant was that we needed to provide earlier access in order to get an earlier start on that. And then the platform productivity and progress wasn't as we intended or planned, so a number of those went quite a bit later than we had originally planned in 2014, so we needed to react to that as we were developing our master operational handover schedule, and we were looking very closely at how we could optimize that. And what you see there is the concrete in train coming through eastbound, followed by westbound, followed by eastbound. That clearly had an impact on our overall program. So that broke our line, our red horizontal line between the track walkways and OLE into 2 dates, one in March and one in May. And it also, what it forced us to think about was our testing and commissioning, but and dovetailing that in, so we have our November 17 date and our January 2018 date sort of was all part of working through those interdependencies driven by that requirement by Crossrail to start its dynamic testing on those 2 very, very important dates to Crossrail. So that gives you a flavour of that. Looking into the actual schedule itself, looking at the critical path in a slightly different way and how we articulate that. So an animation here of what we have in terms of our centre. It's really how the stations, the most critical stations, so Farringdon, Liverpool Street, Whitechapel and Stepney Green, which is actually a shaft, the dependencies between those stations, those most critical ones, and our system-wide fit-out, which happens not only in the tunnels but also within the stations, where we have over 1,000 equipment rooms and routes that we need to make available to our system-wide contractors. So that's a depiction there of our pretty well understood critical path, revealing sort of some of what's behind that. You see platforms and construction driving the critical path, together with M&E and fit-out. That really applies to the rooms. The equipment rooms that are being, I say there's over 1,000 rooms and routes which we have to make available for our communications, signalling, HV power, and comms, which all need to go into those stations, install their equipment, and prior to start testing that, as we see there, going through floating track slab, installation of other tunnel services, signaling comms. Then we get into static testing, and then phase 3 testing, which is where we start the integration of all those systems together. EDT is our early dynamic testing, followed by which was where we brought it forward, going through to our dynamic testing, which is due to complete in July 2018. Then we followed by trial running. So there's our overall critical path. Next subject is just sort of moving on in terms of reporting. So we have an awful lot of information on Crossrail, and an awful lot of it is in databases. In terms of the planning community, a lot of that resides in P6 databases, but we need to get useful management reports out of that. So we're constantly questioning and challenging the data to make sure that it is as robust as we can make it. But it's really all about, for me, what does it all mean, and what management action and reaction do they need to take to any information that's coming out of some of the detail. So one of the things we're really quite proud of in Crossrail is we have built a what's called our planning page. It's basically an intranet for the planning team and the project management community within Crossrail. It's like an intranet site. But what we've done there is it's sort of a front end on a SharePoint series of files. We've got a pyramid there which sort of contains most of our schedules. Some of those are P6, some of them are level zeros at the top there. But within that, so we've got our daily progress reports, and I'm going to come on to show some of those. So we publish daily, depending on what they are. We produce daily reports. So for tunneling, we produce daily reports. For track installation, track concrete at the moment, we produce daily reports. Other things are weekly. And then we have our one-page summary schedules. So in the map, we have an interactive map at the bottom. So For each one of the stations, we have if you click on any of the links to any of the stations, you will get to a one-page plan. I'll show you an example. But what this does is it has proven a very effective communication tool to the business, and what it has also done is cut down any conversations or phone calls in terms of what dates are currently being forecast, or what the schedule looks like for Bond Street, Tottenham Court Road stations, because people in the business know that they can just go to the latest version of the schedule, which are generally, in fact in most cases, updated every period, so they can get a very recent view, or the most up-to-date view of what the current programs are for any particular schedule. So that covers not only stations, but system-wide links are on the right-hand side there as well. So I'm going to focus on a couple of areas of these, couple of examples. So there's number one there is PES, that's our platform edge screen. Number two, which is actually above the running rails within any station. Second one is track, and the third one down the bottom there is, I'm just going to show you an example of a Bond Street one-page summary plan. So that's the platform edge screen. Report goes out weekly. We've actually nearly finished our platform edge screen construction. You'll see there on the right-hand side, that's where the PES is. It's effectively a duct, ventilation duct above the running rails. But it's critical that was completed before you can see in the photograph there's no running rails in there, and that's why the PES needs to be in there beforehand. So if anything to the left, there's a hoarding there on the right-hand side. The station is on the other side of that, and it basically segregates the rail side of the installation from the station side on the other side. So good example there of a report. There is a progress curve, there's periodic table there on the right-hand side, and we were measuring ourselves against our MOSH baseline, against where we actually are, or what we've actually achieved to date. Next one, a very hot topic in Crossrail at the moment, is how we're getting on with our daily track concreting. So that the track is laid on the sleepers and then is concreted in. So either by using our concrete train, that 450-meter long train, which I showed the picture of before, or by our shuttles, working in two different areas. We track this on a daily basis, and very much gets the focus of Crossrail senior management. So what does it tell us? We've got some overall statistics there. So we've got various different types of track which we need to install. I won't go into any of that detail, but nevertheless some cumulative figures there. We've got a two-week rolling window, which tells exactly what we should have done last week against our weekly plan, and also how we're doing this week. There's obviously a cumulative curve there, so you can see that we're tracking with a red line slightly behind our base program, and then we've got a graphic on the bottom right-hand side, bottom left-hand side, showing how we're doing in terms of our concrete program. So there's a graphic there which just indicates where we're actually currently working. The one-page summary schedules, I think, have been very useful around the program. There's an extract of a summary program that's for Bond Street. Sort of key features of that are, we've got a critical path, quite a lot of it critical. Bond Street is probably one of our more critical stations at the moment. There's the baseline, so the skinny black line underneath the sort of the wider red lines are critical. And then we use these sort of for annotation. The annotations work well. They sort of highlight particular features or particular contractual, it could be contractual milestones or whatever else they might be, or design programs. That's all up there represented at the top. But I think these have been, I say, very useful, and in terms of communicating just on a page what's happening with specific project schedules, without going into P6. Then obviously that's available if project managers and the wider management team need to see them. But I think for most senior management in Crossrail, probably gives them as much information as they need. So in terms of, we are 2 years out from our sort of major date, December 2018 for Crossrail, when we'll be running those trains through the central section. So what are our major challenges? I'll just sort of summarize them here. So Crossrail is more than 75% complete. Our track program is 50% complete, but there are an awful lot of services, cable management systems, cabling for comms, signaling, HV power systems which need to be installed within our tunnel sections. They need to feed into individual stations, so we're spending an awful lot of time looking at the planning of those in order to meet our overall aspirations of our master operational handover schedule. Stations, we are continuing, particularly with our main stations, the detailed planning, trying to, as an example, at Bond Street, our master plan shaft, which is at the Eastern Ticket Hall. We're working very closely with Costain Skanska joint venture to put together a plan which will support our overall program and the opening of Eastern Ticket Hall there. So there's very significant challenges at a number of our stations, but nevertheless we recognise that, and we're putting plans in place to support that. Haven't really spoken too much about on-network works and the work that Network Rail are doing, but it's obviously fundamental to the success of Crossrail, a huge work bank that Network Rail are currently undertaking, from platform extensions to fibre optic cable installations, to open sections down to Abbey Wood, which are and Abbey Wood Station itself, which Network Rail are delivering for Crossrail. So we will continue to focus on and work with Network Rail to integrate our programs, and especially at the moment with our testing and commissioning of the interfaces, which is key that we need to work through that so that we're all joined up and we can support our overall objectives for dynamic testing in November 2017. I haven't mentioned trains really, but Bombardier are currently, they have their first train built. It's undergoing testing in Melton Mowbray at the moment for the trains to follow on the production line. Our first train will arrive for testing out on the network in the east in November this year. First train, I say, will go into service in May next year between Liverpool Street Chenfield, so we are not forgetting the train program. There are 60 trains to be built and get into service on the program, so we need to continue to monitor and work with Bombardier. We have Bombardier also, it's not written there, but building the depot in Old Oak Common. Progress is going well there, but we need to make sure that we just support our train delivery program into Old Oak Common going forward. And then testing and commissioning and handover, this is going to become the name of the game in Crossrail. A lot of focus, steering groups, etc. being established, big focus on testing and commissioning, planning that out and having the tools and the metrics that sit behind that to support our testing and commissioning and handover program, how that interfaces with our infrastructure managers and our train operating companies, which is MTRC, are all very much in our minds and things that we need to get right in our sort of final 2 major years of this program. I'm happy to hand back and take any questions if there are any.
Fantastic, thank you very much for that. We have got quite a few questions coming in, so I'll get started with the first one. Firstly, do you use Primavera for all sector programs? If not, what else do you use? What is the most effective tool to disseminate the program information?
We use in terms of planning software, we only really use Primavera P6. It is a very user-friendly piece of software. Very, very powerful. We don't nearly use all of the functionality of it. So in Crossrail, I haven't even mentioned this, but we don't, within Crossrail as a client organization, we don't cost load the schedules. But exclusively, that's what we use. We know that's how we structure our integrated programs. We know that other schedules are developed offline or in Microsoft project, but when it comes down to our schedules and what Crossrail uses as its in-house software of choice, it is P6 and Primavera. We summarize that and we present it in other ways. You see some, there's one-page schedules that are produced in Excel because they're pictures, used for a different purpose, but when we're in terms of calculating critical paths and calculating durations and for each project, we use Primavera.
How long was spent planning the program of work prior to commencement of any activity?
I would answer that saying, Crossrail has been on the drawing board for a long time. I can speak from my own personal experience. When I arrived 6 years ago, there were some very well established plans in place, which at that time we were going through parliamentary approvals before we finally got the sort of the green light from the government. So I would say that for even prior to that, there was very well established plans in place for Crossrail. I mean, Crossrail has been planned for I don't know, 15, 20 years even. There have been plans that existed for Crossrail, but I would say in angst certainly for the past 10 years. I would say there have been very well developed plans for Crossrail.
How do you measure progress and value?
Okay, in some cases that is very easy. In other places it becomes very difficult and is much more subject to opinion and sort of judgment. So when we're doing track or measuring track progress, that's pretty easy. We have to install sleepers and rail and do all that, but although we do measure that, it's quite easy to measure it. In terms of a useful metric to our senior management, what we decided was we'll measure the track when it's finally concreted in. So that's the measure that gives our senior management a sort of pulse on how we're getting on with the in terms of progressing the project. In other areas it is much more difficult. So at a station, for example, at Paddington, where there's a lot of different opinion in terms of quantities that are to be installed or to be measured. So it gets very difficult if it's not. Tunneling's very easy, but how many meters of cables are we going to install in Paddington? Not an easy thing to do because designs or whatever drive some of that, and it's not necessarily all that clear in some cases. So it gets difficult. CMS, so cable management systems, that you can see in the photograph there. If it's still on your screens, easier to measure. We have drilling machines which are working their way through. We know if the drilling machines have how many meters they've done and how many holes would be in that sort of section. So it really depends on what it is. Some things are really pretty straightforward, but other things are more difficult.
Do you have a process for managing change against the annual baseline throughout the year, or is it only realigned on an annual basis?
So every period, so we set our milestones every year. So I say we've had an annual baseline that goes with a suite of milestones. We call them anchor milestones, and we measure ourselves against the performance towards those milestones every period. We have even higher level milestones which are go to our board. But yeah, we monitor them every period. And what tends to happen is that as we get sort of further through the year, we either change what we're doing, or we realise that our methodology might have changed, and that milestone might have lost some of the sort of status or meaning that it had before. So we might have re-engineered something, but we do monitor them all throughout the year. But we do take the opportunity at the same time in March, just before we re-baseline, to say, well, is that milestone really relevant anymore? If so, we reset it. We reset the milestone, because quite often, it becomes slightly meaningless to measure yourself against the date that was set 12 months before, and the world has moved on, and we need to measure ourselves against the current sort of measurement and yardstick, if you like.
Knowing your program covers several years, how do you decide when you start the detailed plan of each project within the program? Is this all done up front, or do you have a set amount of time you plan ahead in detail, so 3 or 6 months?
Definitely don't do it all up front. So I would say detailed planning, my opinion, 12 to 18 months out. So the next 12 to 18 months in detail. Beyond that, it's got to be sort of much higher level, broad brush. But planning in detail, yeah, I think you need to sort of do a certain level of detail to make sure that the, say for example, when we were doing our tunnel enlargement at Bond Street or Tottenham Court Road, where we're mining stations, to have a clear understanding of the rate that we are expecting to hit in terms of our mining program. We need to know what that is. So I would say we also utilize very detailed 100-day plans. That's been quite very successful around the program. whereby we'll develop sort of sprint plans, which also identify interfaces very on a sort of 3-month sort of basis, looking forward to try and drive some sort of detail at a very sort of short-term milestones and short-term horizons.
During your presentation, you mentioned communication a lot. Do you have challenges communicating with the team, seeing this is such a huge project? And how do you know how to overcome this for successful delivery?
Yeah, we do spend a lot of time communicating. I think it's an art. We do spend a lot of time trying to do effective presentations. I spend a lot of my time preparing those, certainly to senior management, communicating. I think it's really sort of one of the things that is fundamental to getting it right, cascading that information, planning information, which is really why our annual process of going through and baselining our schedule and communicating what that means, having the roll-up from our project schedules into the sector schedules into our overall strategic schedule is important, and that really comes together once every year. But there's a big communication exercise that goes with that to make sure that everybody's aligned with what their major milestones are within their particular sectors, and then that rolls down into what do they have to do on a project level and individual steps to get along there. So we do spend a lot of time.
What methods do you employ to ensure contractors keep on target within the schedule?
Okay, so that's been a constant discussion, dialogue that we've been having around Crossrail, because clearly we are not going to agree with our contractors all the time what the schedule looks like, which is why I made the sort of important point that we don't roll up what our contractors are saying necessarily into our management plans and into our master operational handover schedules, because we're from the perspective of what we call our tier 1 contractors, their view of the world may be very different from what Crossrail is planning, and we may have management actions which we think and know, or even know that we're going to take, which may realign their schedule back towards where Crossrail and Crossrail's strategy needs it to be. So we do spend, obviously, we get submitted schedules by our contractors every period. We methodically go through those and provide, and under the NEC we have to accept or reject them. So we do, our project planners spend a lot of time doing that and trying to get to an acceptable and accepted schedule that works and effectively cascades all the way up and down from our strategic objectives. So we do spend a lot of time doing it. We realize that quite often we are not aligned with our contractors, and a lot of that can be driven from contractual or commercial issues which Crossrail and the contractors need to sit down and work through, because without that alignment on the contractual and commercial side, we will not have a fully joined up schedule which the contractor is fully aligned with. So yes, so the answer to the question is we spend an awful lot of time interrogating those schedules and trying to understand why and what's driving those schedules. If it's purely construction-related activities, then that's fine. We'll look at that, and we're obviously constantly re-engineering schedules and replanning if obstacles come along in the way and we realize that we cannot build things or construct things that our original plan had intended.
How often do you run schedule risk analysis on plan?
Okay, the answer to that question, on a program level, we do it every 6 months, and if we have specific critical projects such as Ilford, we will do it on an ad hoc basis depending on the requirements of the project. So at a program level, every 6 months we are obliged to run an SQRA to our sponsors, the Department for Transport and Transport for London. So we have to do that, and we have to declare our confidence levels of achieving our opening 3 stages, is what we have done so far. So we spend an awful lot of effort trying to make sure that our schedules are robust. We go through a methodical series of risk identification workshops and quantifications, and then we have to apply that to our level 1 schedules, which are the input to the risk model. So yeah, so every 6 months it gets a lot of focus. Our sponsors are very keen to know what our confidence levels are, if we've made it, what our assumptions might be around that, or what any mitigations that we may need to take to either bring back the program or to achieve that level of confidence. So yeah, it's a major subject for Crossrail.
And you spoke about the risk model. How do you integrate and align the separate functions of planning and risk?
I would say that the planning team produces its level 1 schedule. We update it every period anyway. One of the primary reasons for doing that, apart from sort of making sure that all our anchor milestones and our key milestones are up to date, is to be the base model which is imported into the risk model and the risk software, which we use PertMaster. So we have to get that right, and make sure that the quantification of risks are in sync with what the durations that have been allowed for in that model. So the quantification of risk with respect to whatever activities we have needs to be very well aligned. So I say we do spend about every 6 months we spend 3 or 4 weeks making sure that the base model is right, and then that the risks are appropriately aligned and attached to that. Yeah, I say there's plenty of there's risk workshops. So we're going through this process at the moment. So we've got a whole series of risk workshops which are currently ongoing to provide the identification and quantification of those risks. And then there is a degree of judgment in terms of how those are applied in the risk model. But that's where we will have to work very closely with our risk team to make sure that what we put in there is robust and stand up to scrutiny. So we spend a lot of time making sure that that it is fit for purpose.
You mentioned that Crossrail planners interrogated the contractors' programs and summarized them into their own integrated programs. How did you ensure the contractors were reporting and scheduling their plans accurately? We trust our project planners to do that. I think our project planners understand each individual project very well because that's their bread and butter. That's what they do. So typically for a station, Bond Street, we have 2 planners down there constantly interrogating what the contractor is sending through. So I think we understand what we think is achievable. We have our own project teams, but clearly the contractor has their views, and we're not going to agree all the time. So it's really about working through together with the contractor to come up with what we collectively think is a deliverable schedule, and that we're all aligned on how we're going to deliver that. But it's got to be achievable, it's got to be buildable, and it's really got to meet our overall objectives. And really that's what our planners are. I think we've got a very good understanding. A lot of our planners have been around for a long, been engaged in Crossrail for quite some time now, and we do understand it very well. So constant challenges over there. We're not saying any of it's easy. No station is easy, or any other contract. So we go through the same sort of robust discussions that you have on sites around schedule and cost and everything else. So yeah, so I think we're just working through that, but we've got to be realistic into when the contractor says he can't do it, we've got to try and interrogate it and want to understand what's behind that. It would be technical issues or cost issues, maybe factors in that, or just general sort of constructability issues. But that's what our planners and our project teams work through on a site-by-site and project-by-project basis.